In December 2021, baristas at a single Starbucks location in Buffalo, New York, voted to unionize. Over 4 years later, the union continues to grow and has won elections at nearly 700 locations. Since November 2025, over 12,000 Starbucks workers from 670 stores across the country walked off the job in what became the longest national unfair labor practice strike in the company's history, with many returning to work just last month. Welcome back to Art of Citizenry, where we unpack the systemic power structures that have shaped culture, politics, and policy. I'm your host, Manpreet Kaur Kalra. Every day across the United States, Starbucks workers are dealing with short staffing, unpredictable scheduling, low pay, and rising healthcare costs. After nearly 2 years of negotiations, baristas are still without a first contract. In February 2024, Starbucks committed to reach a first master contract by the end of the year. Then came Brian Niccol. The new CEO joined in September 2024 with a compensation package that equated to the largest CEO to worker pay gap among any S&P 500 company, and contract negotiations effectively collapsed. What followed was a $1 billion restructuring plan that shuttered hundreds of locations. Among the closures were nearly 10% of all union locations. That included the Starbucks Reserve Roastery, one of the company's first unionized stores, and a location that, not uncommonly, had a line wrapped around the street corner. Workers at that location learned that they had lost their jobs before the company told them directly, some finding out through social media. At other locations, baristas reported showing up to their shifts only to find the doors locked and the building empty. Starbucks is the biggest violator of labor law in modern U.S. history. More than 1,100 charges have been filed against the company since the start of the union's campaign for things like retaliation for organizing and illegal unilateral workplace policy changes. Hundreds of those changes are still unresolved, and the union has filed over 200 ULPs in the last year alone as Starbucks continues to employ union-busting tactics. And the pressure isn't just coming from workers. Ahead of the company's March 25th annual shareholder meeting, a coalition of long-term investors is urging shareholders to vote against the re-election of 2 board members, citing years of backsliding on labor relations that the board has failed to address. Today, we're talking to someone on the front lines to better understand what it's actually like to be a worker in this fight right now. From the shop floor to the picket line. I'm joined by Megan Erickson, a Starbucks union member and barista in Philadelphia.
The store that I work at is Chestnut Hill, and it is actually one of the first ever Starbucks locations to open up in Philadelphia. So it's really like when they talk about wanting to create a third place, when they talk about like being a coffee community house, it is truly that space, which is amazing. I did work at Starbucks in Illinois for a little bit and then briefly in Center City here in Philadelphia. But now that I've been at my current location for as long as I have, I've really gotten to dive into what it means to be a community connector here in the space. My store unionized April or May of 2025. So relatively new to the union aspect of it, but it is Philadelphia and we are a union town. So it's pretty easy to jump in.
To understand the culture Starbucks sells to customers, you have to understand the inspiration Starbucks built itself around. In 1983, Howard Schultz walked into an espresso bar in Milan and came back with a vision. America didn't have a communal coffee culture. People grabbed coffee to go, drank it alone, made coffee at home. Schultz wanted to change that. He borrowed a term from sociologist Ray Oldenburg, the third place, meaning a place outside of home and work that serves as a community gathering hub, and made it the cornerstone of Starbucks' identity. For a while, it worked. Stores were packed, employees witnessed first dates, marriage proposals, community coming together, creating together. But the company that built its brand on human connection has spent the last decade quietly dismantling the conditions that made that possible. And even as the current CEO, Brian Niccol, arrived from Chipotle to Starbucks in 2024, invoking the third place as a rallying call for his Back to Starbucks strategy, the workers who actually build that community every single day have been left without a contract, without reliable hours, and without a seat at the table.
Yeah. Well, for me, a community connector is someone who just can provide authentic human interaction with people. And Starbucks loves to call us the third place, this environment for people to be able to feel comfortable, feel seen, to go to on their downtime. But the people who are actually making that happen are people like me, the baristas who are making those drinks, who are asking about our regulars' grandchildren or checking in on them when they go into the hospital. Like, we're the ones who are really building that solidarity on the ground just by working and being ourselves and making those moments happen.
Starbucks has spent decades selling the idea that its storefronts are a place for care and community. But behind that branding is a workforce that is increasingly stretched thin, navigating short staffing, unpredictable hours, low wages, and the pressure to deliver warmth and connection on a schedule that doesn't always make that possible. So for listeners who have never worked a shift at Starbucks, what does that actually look like right now?
Yeah. So this is a bit of a nuanced question because they all look different in every single community, right? So right now for me, what it's looking like in my store, where we have those years and years and years of regulars that have come in for quite literally decades, it's a little different. We have all these very interpersonal relationships. You're clocking in, start time is 4:30 a.m. And usually it's going to look like all of your staffing hours are being dedicated to that morning rush. And then once lunchtime comes around, you basically have two people on the floor the rest of the day. With that being said, if you're a Starbucks worker right now, you also have a level of insecurity on like what your schedule is actually going to be like. We're expected to have all these open hours of availabilities so we can fit into their perfect little business operation hours that they go by. And to be honest, it's not getting most of our needs met. We're short-staffed and having this false sense of scarcity for our hours. So when we are scheduled, we're like there to really work, and yet we don't have enough people on the floor to help make it run.
To understand why baristas started unionizing, you have to go back to 2021 to a Starbucks in Buffalo, New York. For some time, workers had quietly tolerated what had become an increasingly familiar set of grievances: broken equipment, chronic understaffing, hours being cut without warning, and low wages that barely budged even for workers who had been with the company for years. Then the pandemic hit. Workers found themselves on the front lines without adequate protections. Many felt the company was pulling back on COVID-19 safety precautions too quickly and too aggressively. The gap between being called a partner and actually being treated like one had never felt wider. When the Buffalo store voted to unionize in December 2021, it set the stage for many to follow. It wasn't just a single store win. It was proof that it could be done. Within 6 months, 280 Starbucks locations across 35 states had followed the Buffalo filing. In fact, the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, reported a 57% national surge in union representation filings across the country between October 2021 to March 2022. And so, Megan, what was that moment for you that made you think, we need a change, we need to unionize?
I actually was out doing an internship, ironically enough, with the Starbucks Corporation when my store was actively making the effort to unionize. I definitely got a phone call because I knew I was going back, and they're like, "Are you a yes?" I'm like, "Obviously, yeah, I'm coming back. And I want to be at a union store." But while I was away on this internship, I got to visit the New York City headquarter office, and I was pulled aside by one of the workers there, and he was going on and on and on about how my regional district manager was like number one in partner security and how he really advocates for like workers on the floor and making sure that they feel comfortable and safe. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to me, my store within that same week had gotten an active threat phone call, and the workers on the floor were told that if we locked the doors, we'd be punished. We could get written up or straight up lose our jobs. And then it was radio silence from our management. So no one knew what to do. No one knew what was happening. And later when this was addressed, I found out that our DM was in conversation with other people and de-escalating it on his own. But I was like, you need to be able to have the capacity to communicate that with us so that we don't go on red alert, that we feel safe and secure in our workplace. So when I came back from my internship and they told me that, I was like, no, like we're already a union. Let's act like a union. So I sat down with my DM and I was like, I would want some clear guidelines on what your expectations are, because we know that we cannot have this ambiguity when it comes to people's lives. And you made the choice to try to keep us open and put ourselves at risk when people felt like it was not safe to be open, not even just as workers, but also our customers. Like these are also people who come in here and sit down and have a cup of coffee with their family. Like we had no understanding or no clear instructions on how to handle that situation. We could have systems and processes in place to make sure that we can avoid getting to that extreme point. Like, why do you only have reactive solutions? Why don't you have proactive solutions? Why are you not asking us what we need to do to be better? I was really put in an incredible spot to already have a store that's unionized, to feel empowered to sit my DM down and demand that he come and take some time and make some space to retrain our entire staff on the floor to make sure that they had whatever grievances that they had about that situation laid out for him to directly address, because it was a scary situation.
What you're describing is not just a policy failure, it's a power imbalance dressed up as protocol.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You know, there is that power play that you have when you go talk to management, but having that level of security, being in a union, allowed me and my other coworkers to feel okay. And they met us where we were at. I mean, of course, there were things that could have been done a little bit better as far as a response to us. The fact that we were allowed to be on an even playing field and demand respect and demand our lives be taken seriously, that was really nice. And it wasn't anything that I've ever been able to do in any of my previous jobs.
In the United States, over 680 Starbucks stores are now unionized, but they still don't have a contract. More than 2 years after the first Starbucks store elected to unionize, Starbucks and Workers United announced a path forward to create a foundational framework for contracts, establishing a fair process for organizing and resolving outstanding legal issues. National framework bargaining began in April 2024. Over the subsequent 9 months, baristas and Starbucks executives met for hundreds of hours and notched 33 tentative agreements that would tangibly improve the workplace. In September 2024, around the same time Brian Niccol came on as Starbucks' new CEO, union baristas presented a set of economic proposals for negotiation to increase wages and benefits. In December 2024, Starbucks said no to all the proposals, and in exchange put forth an unserious economic package that did not raise wages in the first year of the contract, nor did it address the core issues of hours and staffing. In turn, Workers United filed a major ULP charge alleging Starbucks is failing to bargain in good faith and undermining the representative status of the union.
So right now, as far as bargaining goes, we have agreed upon about 98% of the contract. A lot of that centers around workplace security, representation, seat at the table. But what we're focusing on right now is that last 2%, which is really going to be centered around the economic package. So what does it look like to have fair pay, reliable hours and scheduling, things that are really going to make an impact on the day-to-day lives of the people who are clocking in hourly. To be able to come into a space knowing, what my day is going to look like, who's going to be on the floor with me, knowing that it's going to be adequately staffed, knowing that I'm making all the hours I need to financially be making, that's going to be huge. Starbucks is the biggest labor law violator in modern US history. So we're just trying to get them to pay for all of the unfair labor practices that they have been committing.
Workers United has filed over 1,100 unfair labor practice charges against Starbucks, with administrative law judges finding the company committing over 400 labor law violations, including firing pro-union employees, threatening store closures, spying, intimidating workers, and creating policies specifically designed to hinder union activity.
Right now, I have to have 150% of the hours that I want available for Starbucks to put me in whatever scheduling they want me to do. So that means that if they are choosing to cut hours for business operations, then my availability still has to be that open, even though I'm probably going to have to work 2 or 3 jobs to be able to pay my rent or to be able to actually use the health benefits that I pay for. But the biggest thing is we want people to feel safe and supported on the floor. And that means knowing that there's going to be adequate staff. And it means knowing that they're going to be able to actually pay their rent at the end of the month, that their hours aren't being messed with because Starbucks decides to cut back.
Last November, baristas launched their 4th strike in 2 years. The Red Cup Rebellion became the longest national unfair labor practice strike in the company's history. Demands remain clear: an end to union busting and a fair contract that locks in fair pay, reliable hours and scheduling, and real protections. Historically, strikes are how the 8-hour workday was won, how weekends became a right rather than a privilege, minimum wage, child labor protections, the right to organize, all have been fought for by workers who decided the alternative was worse and the companies they worked for could do better.
Strikes are one of the most powerful ways the working class can show their corporations that we are absolutely essential and at the center of anything that goes on with their business. Brian Nickel wouldn't be able to make his paycheck if I didn't clock in, if the majority of the people weren't out there working in the retail space. Corporate wouldn't exist if retail didn't exist. So it's really important that we use our platform as workers to advocate for ourselves. No one really wants to go out on strike. It is the last minute ditch effort to prove to them that we have a lot of power in numbers. There are significantly more of us than there are of them. And we are the ones that are making the stores run. So if they're not going to meet us on what we demand to have at the stores to be able to successfully run the stores the way that we want to, withholding their labor is like the most powerful way to do that. And with strikes, it's not just that element of removing yourself from the workplace, but it also means getting engaged in your community. One thing I've noticed since we started the strike in November is there are so many other sectors and so many other corporations whose workers are going out on strike right now. Like everyone is seeing that power. And so strikes are not only powerful to kind of stick it to the man, but it's also really powerful to bring communities together and showcase that, hey, like we might not have the same job background, but we are fighting for the same things. Like we all want to be able to live dignified lives. And so that element of striking, I would argue, is almost more powerful than the withholding aspect. It's the building of solidarity and the alignment that can happen with your local neighbors if you just sit there and take the time to talk to them and have them see you do something that's really, really powerful.
I want to make sure we sit with that for a second because months without a paycheck while still showing up every day to organize and hold a community together is not a small task. How long were you and your team out on strike?
Well, we just returned, but we had made it to 98. And now we're back in stores here in Philly. There's still strikes that are happening throughout the nation. But for us, we were consecutively out for 3 months. So it was time to just take our energy and take our relationships that we built and bring it back into the stores and get connected with our customers and get them caught up to speed and bring them into our reality, which is that we're all in this fight together.
To understand what's actually at stake in these negotiations, it helps to look closely at the numbers because Starbucks has been telling a very different story than the one workers are living. The company has publicly claimed that its workers earn $30 an hour. What they don't say is how they get to that figure. The $30 amount includes the full value of every benefit Starbucks potentially offers, or to put it in tech terms, total compensation. The actual starting wage of baristas in most U.S. states is $15.25 an hour. And most workers never see the full benefits of the package at all because Starbucks schedules the majority of its baristas at an average of 19 hours a week, just below the company's threshold to qualify for those benefits. So essentially, Starbucks controls both the hours and the eligibility threshold, keeping workers just under the line. The result is that many baristas rely on SNAP and Medicaid to get by. And the cracks are showing, not just for workers, but for customers too.
My store, for instance, it's been around for over 20 years. And the regulars that I have, we talk about all the time on what it was like to be here when Starbucks first entered the neighborhood and the level of resources that the workers had and the longevity of their stay at Starbucks as a customer and also as the workers, and how that's changed throughout time. A lot of that really is a disconnect on every management level. Because right now for me, I know my manager is the one who has to come in and fill those gaps that he's not allowed to schedule for, right? Now, that puts us in a hard spot because I want hours and he also needs a break, right? So it's not even us versus management. It's all of us versus the C-suite executive. They are making really well-intentioned decisions that are affecting everyone. When Brian Nichol first came in as CEO, he did, I want to say, 1,000+ layoffs on the corporate space in March. And then we saw another wave that was unofficially a round of layoffs for them. And then a third. And that third one is when it touched the stores as well. I think it's important for everyone to understand, no one is fighting this because they hate the corporation or they hate this job. All of us who are in the union and all of us who are making these efforts to make the workplace a lot better are because we want to keep the parts of Starbucks that are deeply human. And hey, maybe CEOs shouldn't be making billions of dollars if I can't pay my rent. You can have that paycheck when I don't have to choose between starving or having a place to live.
The narrative that often gets pushed back at unions and at workers who organize is that they're disgruntled, they're troublemakers, that they just don't like their employer. But this is a fight by people who care enough about what Starbucks could be to demand that it do better. Baristas are serving billions of dollars in revenue for a company whose CEO made $96 million in the first 4 months on the job. To further contextualize this, the CEO of Starbucks made around 6,666 times more than the company's median employee in 2024, who made $14,674. Within months of joining Starbucks, Nickel announced that the company would be closing over 100 North America locations as part of a $1 billion restructuring plan, closures that appear to disproportionately hit unionized stores. For those who have listened to this podcast for some time, you might be thinking, this sounds a lot like the private equity playbook. Restructuring, layoffs, store closures, decreased capacity, etc., all while ensuring profit remains in the pockets of executives. And the people who pay the price, as always, are workers.
I think we can see that it is always a top-down decision, right? This is coming from Brian himself, who's not working on the floor, who doesn't have access to what these different spaces need. And this is not necessarily just a Starbucks issue. This is for me, a much bigger issue in general of mega corporations who make these blanket statements on what the floor should look like when every single community requires different things. And ultimately, the people who run the stores, from baristas to shift supervisors and, dare I say, store managers, they're really going to know what these communities need and the ways that they need to show up for them. But they're being limited with the top-down decisions of trying to make everything unified and find these one-size-fits-all answers. But you can't dictate and determine what authenticity looks like.
Let's talk about union busting. All of this is happening against a backdrop that makes it harder than ever to fight back. The current administration fired the National Labor Relations Board's general counsel, who had directed the agency to seek stronger remedies for workers fired for organizing. Her replacement came from Morgan Lewis, the same law firm representing the corporations the NLRB is supposed to hold accountable. We touched on Morgan Lewis, known for its hardline union busting tactics, in episode 22 of this podcast, The Co-op Illusion. Union busting refers to the range of tactics employers use to stop workers from organizing or to undermine unions that already exist. It can be overt, firing organizers, closing unionized stores, threatening workers with job loss, or it can be slow and structural, flooding bargaining sessions with lawyers, stalling negotiations, cutting hours for workers who are visibly involved in organizing. Just recently, Starbucks announced it is closing 5 locations in Seattle, 4 of which are unionized locations. So what union busting tactics are you seeing firsthand?
The biggest things that you see are they're spending a lot of money on lawyers that are specialized in being anti-union. And they are spending a lot of time in creating a separation of conversation between workers and management and corporate. So that way, on the higher level, they can control the narrative. Right now, we're not being met in good faith. We're not being met with, I would argue, a dignified response. In general, when you think of a union, you don't necessarily think of baristas, right? When I think of a union, I think of the factory unions or the steelworkers unions or the nursing unions. Very intense, very hands-on, essential workers. And that narrative hasn't really changed. That definition hasn't really changed, I would argue, for what most people are seeing when we talk about getting a fair contract, right? But we have a huge snowstorm in Philly and the expectation was to come into work. So even though I wasn't necessarily deemed an essential worker in most people's minds, I'm expected to be there. I'm expected to be there during the pandemic. I'm expected to take up this space and do this work. And therefore I deserve to be met with respect. And throughout this entire process, we've always been told we're just pouring a cup of coffee, we're just sweeping the floors. But at the end of the day, people expect us to be there. We keep getting proposals that are, you should be so lucky to have this. Why are you asking for more? When the conversation shouldn't be, why are you asking for more? It should be, why don't you think that my life and my time is worth it to you? Like, why do you not think I should be able to work here and pay for my rent and use the healthcare that I have taken out of my paycheck?
Under U.S. labor law, once workers vote to unionize, the employer is legally required to bargain in good faith with the union that represents them. That obligation comes from the National Labor Relations Act, which requires both sides to meet at reasonable times, exchange proposals, and genuinely attempt to reach a collective bargaining agreement. Good faith bargaining doesn't necessarily mean a company has to agree to every demand, but it does mean that you cannot stall negotiations indefinitely, refuse to provide necessary information, or make unilateral changes to wages and working conditions while talks are underway. When companies delay meetings, repeatedly cancel sessions, or refuse to engage on key proposals, those tactics often amount to surface bargaining or bad faith negotiating, as in the company is going through the motions without any real intent to reach a deal.
So to bargain in good faith is to come with the intention of working together, to come with the intention of bringing real proposals that can showcase where you can compromise and how you can make that up. And also coming to the table and not stalling. Like, I should be able to give you a proposal and you should have a good turnaround time for that. I shouldn't have to wait 6 to 7 months later to hear what your proposals are. Like, this should be top priority for you. You respect my time, I'm respecting yours. We got to experience that all of 2024. And then Brian Nickel became the new CEO. And then all of 2025 was just met with silence.
Let's break down some of the demands Starbucks Workers United is fighting for. Let's start with hours, because most baristas are deliberately scheduled below the threshold to qualify for benefits. The union's first ask is straightforward: allot hours to existing workers before hiring new ones. Pair that with a minimum of 3 workers on the floor at all times to run stores safely and efficiently. On pay, workers are asking for a wage floor of $17 an hour with a 4% annual raise built into the contract to keep pace with inflation and rising living costs. Beyond the paycheck, the union is pushing for tangible, enforceable protections, not policy language that lives in a handbook and disappears when a manager decides to ignore it, but real accountability mechanisms, a binding process for resolving workplace disputes quickly and fairly, and a seat at the table on health and safety decisions. And then there's the issue that sits underneath all of this: accountability for the illegal union busting that has been happening since workers started organizing. Starbucks owes millions of dollars in back pay to current and former baristas. More than 600 labor law violations remain unresolved. A fair contract doesn't just address what happens going forward, it reckons with what's already been done.
I mean, really, a fair union contract, it's all those things, right? It's going to be, I know my hours. I know that I'm going to have a team that supports me. I know that there's leadership on the floor that can address incidences and also allow the store and allow the workers to feel supported. And also, it's going to allow us to create a sense of empowerment as workers, to be able to not feel that power imbalance. Us, when we go talk to our manager or a DM or whatever that looks like, it's going to create space for us at the table on the local level just as much as we're seeing it on the national level. This is a mega corporation. They have a lot of money and a lot of resources, and we are actively seeing that they're using all of that money and all those resources in ways that are the polar opposite of what they should be doing. So just recently, we saw Brian Nickel now has no financial cap on his private jet. Simultaneously, hours are being cut across the board, not just for union stores, but everywhere. All of the workers allowing you to have that unlimited budget. You need to meet us at the table. Like, you have the capacity to make sure that all of these workers can get what they need. And when you do that, too, it's going to provide a space where people are actually going to be like genuinely happy to come to work when we have that security, when we have that level of support and those resources, because they're just showcasing over and over again who they're choosing.
Brian Nickel was recruited from Chipotle to address Starbucks' decline in sales. His strategy, branded as Back to Starbucks, has included things like going back to its third place promise, requiring baristas to leave a note on coffee cups, increasing speed of service, bringing back the condiments bar, reintroducing ceramic mugs, implementing a new dress code, and alongside all of that comes a slew of store closures, job cuts, and selling a major stake of Starbucks China to a private equity firm. He joined at a time when Starbucks corporate was requiring managers to come back to the office, negotiating that he be able to work from his home in Newport Beach, California, which meant he would be using the company jet quite a bit, traveling back and forth between Seattle and California. However, recently, Starbucks lifted its $250,000 cap on Nickel's use of the company jet for private use, citing concerns about his personal safety. Before the cap was lifted, anytime Nickel used the company jet for personal use beyond the $250,000 allotment, which is a lot, he would be required to reimburse the company. That restriction no longer exists because of what is being cited as credible threats to his safety. This all comes against a larger backdrop of U.S. corporations increasing security for executives after the shooting of United Healthcare's CEO last year. Nickel's total security expenses were $1.1 million in 2025, plus $997,000 in expenses related to his use of the Starbucks jet for commuting and personal travel. That's nearly $2.1 million spent on transportation for one person at a company where baristas are struggling to pay rent and qualify for healthcare. Going on strike means walking away from your paycheck. And when you're out on the line for days, then weeks, then months, the question about how to keep people fed, housed, and held together becomes increasingly urgent. Megan, can you tell us a bit about the strike kitchen?
As we were leading up to our strike in November, I was asked to help come up with a potential plan on what feeding our entire union could look like. So while the striking workers here in Philly were doing their picketing and doing their canvassing, we had a local church who allowed us to use their kitchen and just cook daily meals for all of the workers and their families and anyone who showed up for us on the line. We had a lot of like local city councilmen and senators come in and just like see the space and help build morale, and also even taught some classes on like how to sign up for SNAP benefits and like where your local food pantry is. And we also set up a food pantry as well. And we worked with some local grocery stores just to get some food on the table. And it did look a little bit different as we went further and further into the strike. But the main goal was, let's take care of one thing so that way you don't have to worry about it. And the one thing we tackled was food because, you know, we need it to survive and also thrive. Like there's so many studies that talk about how accessible, nutritious, culturally appropriate meals can help someone really be healthier, not just physically, but emotionally, and how that can get them through some really challenging times. So it looked different across the nation. Everyone plugged in different ways. But for us, we just found that local space and scaled it up so we could provide that.
Starbucks is counting on people to not pay attention, on customers walking in, ordering their drink, and moving on, on the gap between what the company says and what workers experience staying absolutely invisible. So I want to ask you this directly. How can listeners show up and support union efforts?
Number one, I would say if you can avoid shopping at Starbucks until we get our first contract, that would be great. If you could delete the app, that would be even better. Those are just small ways that you can support us. You know, it really feels like we're taking on this very huge challenge right now. So I think the next thing that y'all can do outside of just don't give them your money is check in with your people. See, what stores are union and go support those stores. Building solidarity on the ground, making sure that you're really taking the time and space to connect with one another. That is the third biggest ask, I guess, I would have for people. But as far as like how people can show up for us, it is going to be with that solidarity. And we've seen that throughout this entire nationwide strike. Here in Philly, I helped set up our Philadelphia Striking Workers Kitchen and Food Pantry. And we were able to do that because of the relationships that we have on the local level. And again, as tensions build and as things come up in our communities and in our nation, I think being able to plug in those ways and supporting one another simply by asking like, hey, what do you need? What do you need right now? Is it nourishment? Is it like me picking up your kids from school so you can get something done? Like, what does that look like? Because that's what we need right now.
Megan isn't describing a labor dispute in the abstract. She's describing what it actually looks like when a company builds its entire brand on human connection and quietly defunds the conditions that makes that possible for its employees. Unpredictable hours plus wages that don't cover rent, while a CEO pocketing millions neglects the needs of workers fighting for basic benefits. And unfortunately, Starbucks is not an anomaly. Starbucks union baristas are leading by example by showing people how to organize and be heard when you have no seat at the table you've built. The deck is stacked. A corporation with billions in revenue, an army of union-busting lawyers, and a political moment that has made accountability harder to reach. They're pushing forward anyway. Thank you to Megan Erickson for her time and to all who are on the floor and on the picket line organizing. Resources on how to support, find your local union store, and everything we referenced today are in the show notes. In the meantime, start by deleting the Starbucks app and sign the pledge by visiting nocontractnocoffee.org. Art of Citizenry is entirely listener-supported. If you found this conversation insightful, I hope you consider contributing to it by visiting artofcitizenry.com/support. Please subscribe, leave a 5-star review, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you to our producer, Ali Honoré, and editor, Stephen Blevins. Original theme music by Katrina Zemrat.